Welcome to lecture number 3, The Person in the Situation. My apologies for missing class last week. Not only was I quite sick, but I could barely speak. And I finally figured out how to record lectures over my slides, so that is also a plus in helping us move along. So an interesting or intriguing question for this lecture is to think about whether you're more likely to believe that most situations are strong situations, or are you the kind of person that believes most situations are weak situations? And what does that suggest about you and your social behavior and interaction? Give that a thought and maybe discuss it with some of your classmates. So some announcements for this week are, which would have been last week, just a reminder that there's a study guide and that if you haven't already downloaded it and started to use it, please do. Also a reminder that I have, as of last week, or actually the week previous, posted the in the news due dates, and so if you don't know yours or aren't familiar with what the assignment requires, then please ask questions and actually start with reading the syllabus and looking for the in the news due date handout that's going to be posted online. In addition, the topic assignment for the social psychology intervention paper is coming up. You don't get to just pick any topic that you wish. There is a list of topics that are approved, so please be sure to download and read the social psychology intervention paper handout before proceeding to the topic assignment. Also, there at the top of the lecture slides is a code of conduct for class. If you haven't already downloaded that and have a read of it, please do. There are sensitive subjects that we discuss in this class, and it's perfectly fine to discuss those and to be frank and honest about them, but I do want you to be aware of the sensitivity that we need to approach some of these topics with. Finally, in the syllabus it indicates that you should be reading the Word at All reading, and that is available on the Blackboard site, so I hope you have followed the syllabus and downloaded that from the Blackboard site and read it for the next class. So our lecture overview is to look at the person and the situation and interaction. We're just kind of expanding the idea that we did in the first week. And also here there's a reminder that when you see a yellow person symbol, the emphasis in that section of the lecture will be on the characteristics of the individual. And when you see a circle of individuals, all those colors there, that's putting the emphasis on the situation. And then when you see the little yellow figure in the middle of the person, around that circle, so being surrounded by the circle of people, that is an indication that the focus in the lecture is on interaction. So let's begin to look at these items in turn. Okay? So the person. When social psychologists are talking about a person, they are talking about things like personality, values, things that differ from one individual to the next, such as being male or female, young or old. But we're also talking about some characteristics of individuals that we take from place to place, from situation to situation, that influences our behavior. So these are things like motivation. What motivates or drives us to behave in particular ways. That's going to affect the way we respond to situations. Knowledge that we have, our view and beliefs about the world. This is based on past learning experiences and what other people have told us. Also our feelings, which we can break down into attitudes, emotions, and moods. And it's not listed here, but like I said a moment ago, we also have our values, which influence the way that we perceive the world, and they're also related to our attitudes. So let's look back at our social goals that we talked about in the last lecture. We'll look at that in the context of the individual and motivation. So motivation, as I was saying, is the force, the driving energy that moves a person toward a desired outcome. A goal is another way of expressing a desired outcome, something that a person wishes to achieve or accomplish, and a motive is a more fundamental kind of goal for our social survival. And we talked about those a little bit in the last lecture. So let's look at them kind of as an illustration. Here we're saying that a very fundamental or essential type of social goal is to gain status. There are a number of sub-goals that may be important to achieving that status. So at a day-to-day level, we might say, okay, this person's attending class, they have the goal to take good notes and to study for exams and get, be well prepared for exams, and that's all about the broader goal of earning good grades in a class, and maybe good grades in classes over the course of a college career. Doing well in the college setting is preparing a person to get a highly paid, respected job, which is part of how we achieve status in our society. So even though there are certainly different ways to gain status, this set of sub-goals that we were talking about here are part of one way to gain status. So when we talk about motivation for an individual, we're talking about how we're going to go about achieving a goal. And part of that process is an attentional process. How we focus our attention on aspects of our environment or ourselves that are relevant to achieving a particular goal. So if one of our goals is to do well on an exam, focusing on the exam content in the textbook, in the lecture, focusing on our study habits, these are attentional processes, bringing our attention to bear on aspects of the environment or ourselves that are important to achieving our goals. It is observed, however, that there are some behaviors that people exhibit that appear to operate on automatic pilot, that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of attention focused on them. Research has demonstrated this kind of automaticity. This is behavior that's kind of on autopilot. A good example of this sort of thing is when you're walking down the hall and without even really thinking about it, you ask somebody, hey, how are you doing today? Or hey, what's up? And this kind of behavior just kind of bubbles out of our mouth without us really thinking about it much. And we might even repeat it, even though the person has already answered us. And that's an indication that it's not really a conscious or thoughtful process, but rather it's just sort of a automatic thing that we do when we meet people. Another important part of individuals that pertains to our behavior is our knowledge or our background information about ourselves and about the world. So we'll talk about self-concept in a little while, but here we're talking about things that focus on mental representations of the broader world. So it could include other people, it could include places or things or even ideas. So just to give an example for this particular concept of mental representation, let's say that we're going to have a mental representation of a famous person. Most of you will have learned about Martin Luther King at some point in your history. So you have a mental representation of Martin Luther King, and that is including a set of beliefs about who this guy was. You might have some sensory memories. You remember seeing something or hearing something relating to Martin Luther King. Maybe you saw a videotape of his famous speech, I Have a Dream. Maybe you also have some explanations for how Martin Luther King came to be the kind of person that he was. In studies of history about Martin Luther King's background, you might know that he's a religious person, that he experienced depression in his time, and those are explanations that feed into your mental representation of who this guy Martin Luther King is. So it's a combination of a set of beliefs, sensory memories, and explanations about an aspect of the world or another individual. That's a mental representation. It's something you have in your memory and you bring with you from situation to situation and can influence your social behavior. Now we also have some more specific examples of mental representations. So these specific examples are the exemplar and the schema. Okay, so let's think about these types of mental representations and think about examples of them. So an exemplar is a mental representation of a specific episode, event, or individual. So a moment ago we were talking about the mental representation of Martin Luther King. So this is a specific individual. Okay, now when we think about a schema, this is a mental representation capturing the general characteristics of a particular class of episodes, events, or individuals. So here we might think of our mental representation of social activists. So Martin Luther King, although he's a specific example or exemplar of a social activist, we can have a broader mental representation of the characteristics of social activists. People who are good public speakers, for example, people who are passionate about their ideas, people who are willing to take risks and share their ideas in the broader public realm. That is a mental representation of the general characteristics of a social activist. Another concept I want to mention here, and it's not on the slide, is the idea of priming a schema. We introduced the idea of priming in an earlier lecture, and it's also mentioned in your text. Priming is when we bring a mental representation up into awareness. You have many mental representations in your mind that are not currently in your consciousness, they're not currently affecting your thinking processes. But once something in the environment reminds you of a mental representation and you begin to think about and bring into awareness and conscious thought processes your mental representation, then we say that that schema or exemplar is primed. It's brought up into consciousness and it begins to more actively influence our perceptions and reactions to the world. Now let's move on to feelings. Feelings are broken down into three categories: attitudes, emotions, and moods. And each one is somewhat distinct, and it's important to recognize those distinctions, and they influence our behaviors in different ways. Attitudes are favorable or unfavorable feelings towards a particular object. Sometimes we call this the attitude target. It could be a person, it could be an object, it could be an idea. So you can have an attitude about your roommate, you can have an attitude about that damn broken coffee pot, you can have an attitude about democracy or education. These attitudes are comprised of beliefs, feelings, and tendencies to act. We'll expand upon the idea of attitudes and their components at another point in time. But for now, let's keep in mind that an attitude includes a judgment component, favorable or unfavorable, and it also comprises beliefs that contribute to that judgment. So it's a feeling, plus or minus, pro or con, and it's supported by beliefs, and it tends to influence the way we're more likely to act. Now, emotions are relatively more intense. An attitude is something that kind of goes over time and is relatively stable, doesn't really strongly influence you at any given point in time. An emotion, however, is something that is more intense and is characterized by a physiological arousal. So when you feel sad, your body has changes in the way it's feeling. You know, your eyes may dampen, you may have a change in your breathing. When you feel angry, your skin may become flushed, these kinds of things. So emotions are more intense and have a physiological component to them. Now, moods are relatively long-lasting feelings that are less focused than emotions and are not directed towards a particular target, like an attitude is. A mood has a more pervasive or general influence on our reactions to the environment. Probably one of the best ways to think of this is when you are in a grumpy mood, so you're feeling a little irritated or annoyed or angry at nothing in particular, but you find that, you know, what your roommate says something and you kind of snap at that, the dog does something, you kind of give it a kick, or you know, everything in your environment is kind of something that you respond in a negative way to for a considerable period of time when you're in a grumpy mood. Okay? It doesn't really matter whether it was the dog that set you off or your roommate or the broken coffee pot or whatever. Now, it's also important that we consider the self-concept. Now, I'm going to distribute to you via a handout that I'll distribute online or in class if you're in the in-class segment. A self-concept is kind of like a mental representation of who you are, all the beliefs about who you are, the sensory memories about who you are, explanations for how you came to be who you are. This is all part of your self-concept. A common way of assessing self-concept that psychologists use is the Who Am I test, sometimes referred to as a 20 statements task, because you ask a person to answer the question, who am I, 20 times in relatively rapid succession, and people write down the first things that come to mind. Now, when you answer a Who Am I test, it's kind of interesting to think about the categories of information that arise when people write that down. So you write it down, and then you say, okay, what do we see here? Do we see things like our social roles? Do we see our belonging to certain categories like male or female, student, non-student? Do we see social roles like I'm a brother? We might see some specific characteristics such as clever or funny or musically talented. We also might see ambitions. I am striving to be an A student. Okay? A lot of different things. So when you complete that self-concept measure, just kind of have a think about what kinds of information is present. So think of, as I said, the self-concept as kind of being like a self-schema. Now, self-schema, as I said, is a mental representation that captures our views and beliefs about ourselves and is informed by our past experiences, our sensory experiences with living in the world. We also have self-evaluation. This is kind of like an attitude or a collection of attitudes towards ourself. So it could be positive or negative. It could kind of be in the middle. It can be mixed also. We might have positive evaluations of ourselves in some aspects of what we do and negative evaluations of ourselves in other aspects of how we are in the world. Now, one of the ways that a social psychologist views the self-concept is a rather old idea called the looking glass self. This is an idea that we come to understand who we are in part by seeing the way that other people respond to us or reflect back their impressions of us. So the reflected appraisal process is the process through which people come to know who they are in part by observing or even imagining how others view them. So if people, for example, are always saying, wow, you're such a funny person, you may come to understand or integrate into your self-concept that you're a funny person in part because lots of people told you that you're funny. Now, that reflects sort of a passive process where you just kind of come to know who you are because everyone is telling you who you are. You can also turn that around to a more active process where you may strategically present certain aspects of yourself to other people to form, or manipulate their impression of you. So, for example, for a job interview, you may try to appear particularly smart or clever. You may want to, if it's a sales job, show that your best communication skills can be brought to bear on persuading someone. So some related concepts here are social comparison processes. We compare our self-concepts to other people, self-presentation, as I just said, and later when we look at the reading for this coming week, the word at all, we can talk about self-fulfilling prophecy and some related ideas such as stereotype threat. Now, moving on to the situation. Just providing an overview here. We can think of people as situations. They create affordances. They provide descriptive norms for us to notice. We'll look at the idea of pluralistic ignorance, and a specific application of that idea to binge drinking or problematic social behavior on campus. We'll also break rules down into injunctive norms and scripted situations, and we'll compare strong and weak situations and then look at culture in a moment as well. So when we think of persons as situations, what we're essentially saying is that part of the situation that you occupy often is the presence of other individuals. Other people, although they are looking out into the world and finding a situation around them, other people are also being that situation for other individuals. So the people around you are part of the situation. And sometimes the mere presence of other individuals will begin to affect our behavior in a general way. However, we can also see some very specific types of influence, and this is what we're referring to as an affordance. An affordance is an opportunity or threat provided by a social situation, and oftentimes specific individuals in that social situation. From time to time, for example, you might see a job fair advertised at UAA. If you go into a job fair situation, the affordance that's provided there, the opportunity that's provided, is for you to possibly get a job. The opportunity is there for you to share your most desirable, employable skills with individuals who might provide a job. We can also think about threats. If you are walking down a dark alley and you see some guy starting to run towards you with a pipe or something like that, that affordance is saying, "Whoa, dangerous social situation. Here's not just your average situation, but here's a specific thing about this situation that's going to demand you to respond in a certain way." Now, when we look out into the situation, one of the things that social psychologists will find and talk about are descriptive norms. This is information about what people commonly or typically do in a situation. So if you find yourself standing outside of a bank, getting ready to use an ATM, you might notice, wow, people are standing in this line, one behind the other, standing in front of the ATM machine. Your description of that behavior and what is typically expected in that situation is the descriptive norm. So the descriptive norm for an ATM is that people will stand in an orderly line, one behind the other, and keep a certain distance from the person who's actively using the ATM. That describes the behavior there. You don't, however, see people dancing around an ATM or peeking over the shoulder as the person's trying to use the ATM. These do not describe typical behaviors at an ATM. We can also think about what students wear to class. What people wear to class in Alaska is quite different than what people wear to class in California, Southern California in particular. So there's different descriptive norms depending upon the broader situation. Now, I'm going to ask you to kind of apply this idea of a descriptive norm. You look out into an environment, social environment, and you see what is typically the behavior, and you say, well, there's the descriptive norm, and you think, well, that must be the normal behavior. So some social psychology researchers have used this idea to describe situations where people get a little bit misinformed about what's really going on. So imagine you're here in your social psychology class and you don't quite understand a concept that the professor has just explained. And you look around and no one else seems confused. So as you look around the room, the descriptive norm is, apparently, that everyone understands. And because you don't want to look like the only one who doesn't understand, you don't raise your hand. Well, guess what? If there's a bunch of people having that same experience at the same time, appearances aren't really descriptive of what's actually going on. So the descriptive norm here, everyone's looking like they understand, doesn't really describe the situation. And that happens in some cases and can lead to social dysfunctions. So one of those social dysfunctions is described as pluralistic ignorance. This is a phenomenon in which people in a group misperceive, they get it wrong, what's going on with the other people in the group because everyone is acting in a way that's inconsistent with their beliefs. They're all sort of behaving like, it's okay, when in reality they're privately concerned about what's going on. So one research example of that is the idea of pluralistic ignorance in drinking behavior on college campuses. One of the things that occurs when students first come to a college campus, they get freedom, they get of age to drink, is people start to drink a great deal more than they might in other settings. And so the descriptive norm in those kinds of situations are that everybody's drinking and everyone likes drinking and, let's party hardy, right? So over 40% of students tend to binge drink at least twice a month. And males are much more likely to do that than females, 51% versus 40%. And researchers have discovered that pluralistic ignorance plays a role in student drinking, problematic student drinking. So one of the ways that occurs is that the typical student erroneously believes that he or she is relatively alone and being uncomfortable with the level of alcohol abuse on campus. Like, oh, I'm just the square person. Everyone else seems to be having so much fun, and they're just totally into this heavy drinking. And over time, men tend to shift their opinions to be more consistent with the out like, oh, geez, I got to cut back. I got to focus on my studies. But hey, everyone's really getting into this drinking thing, so I guess I will too. So eventually people begin to conform to the misperceived norms or misperceived descriptive norm. So one question you might ask yourself is, how might an intervention to address problematic behavior use this social psychological finding to affect the way people are perceiving drinking and affect the way that people act on that misperception? So another concept that we need to think about in viewing situations is an injunctive norm. Injunctive norms are rules that define what is typically approved or disapproved of in a situation. Note that there's kind of a moral dimension that distinguishes this type of norm from a descriptive norm. Descriptive norm says, hey, most people in Alaska, they wear polar fleece. Okay, that doesn't mean it's wrong to wear, I don't know, a raincoat or something like that. It just means that most people tend to wear polar fleece or layers of clothing in Alaska. That's fine. However, an injunctive norm is saying certain things are important and socially approved, and if you don't follow that injunctive norm, then you're going to get the disapproval of others. So, for example, there might be an injunctive norm that at a funeral you wear black, and if you don't wear black, people are going to frown upon that, or that you're supposed to be solemn and quiet. And if you were actually singing at a funeral and being disruptive and carrying on, then that might actually be disapproved of by others. Now, that, of course, is putting aside Irish wakes. That's part of my heritage, so people can get a little bit rowdy at an Irish wake. So strong situations and weak situations are ways of characterizing social situations in terms of the extent to which they have strong injunctive norms or not. Strong situations demand or have injunctive norms that people act in a particular way. As I was saying, one example of a strong situation is a funeral. Another is a job interview. When you're in a job interview, there are very specific behaviors that you exhibit, and there are very specific behaviors that you don't exhibit. You don't, for example, chew gum and pop bubbles during your interview. You don't take phone calls on your cell phone. You dress appropriately, etc. Weak situations are situations that allow people to behave in a variety of different ways, and there isn't so many strong recommendations or injunctive norms about how to behave. So some examples might be a casual dinner with friends. You can dress how you want to. You can pick food up with your fingers if you want. It's okay. A nightclub might be another example where, a variety of different forms of dress or dancing is allowed. But there might be some very specific nightclubs that might be more like a formal situation or a strong situation. There might be very specific dress codes. So a weak situation is any situation that doesn't have a particularly strong demand for specific types of behavior. It allows for more variety. So culture you can think of as a situation, but a situation that's very general and pervasive. Remember in our diagram of Kurt Lewin's life space, it was kind of the broadest force field. So culture are the beliefs, customs, and habits and language shared by people living in a particular time and place. So here in Alaska we have some cultural features that are different than the cultural features that exist in New York, but Alaskans and New Yorkers have some aspects of American culture that in common that are different than, say, the culture that's in China or Afghanistan. So one broad difference in cultures that social psychologists have attended to is the idea that some cultures can be better described as individualistic. This is a culture that socializes members in that culture to think of themselves as individuals and to give some priority to their own personal goals in comparison to or in contrast with broader social goals. So collectivist cultures, in contrast, are cultures that socialize its members to think of themselves first as members of a larger group and to place the group's concerns before their own. We saw an example of this difference in the comparison between the Caucasian American child doing word puzzles and the Asian American child doing word puzzles in our first or second lecture. Now, if you give many people in a particular national setting a scale or questionnaire that measures this concept, you find that you can find reliable differences between different countries in terms of whether they're more individualistic or more collectivist. So you can think of Canada, South Korea, the United States, Japan, and Mexico as all kind of being examples of countries that have different cultures, and those cultures may differ in terms of these concepts. So in terms of individualism, the countries that I just mentioned, the United States comes out as number 1 ranking, Canada as number 4, and then in a bunch of different countries when they're ranked, South Korea comes out as 44, much more collectivist, Japan is much more collectivist, and Mexico is much more collectivist. Now keep in mind that these are broad cultural differences, but within cultures there may be specific individuals that do not conform to that broader cultural norm. So now we're shifting to the person and the situation interacting. In the first or second lecture, we talked about a variety of ways that occurs. We talked about how different persons respond differently to the same situation, situations choosing the persons, persons choosing their situation, and so on. Just quickly review those concepts and then we'll move on here. So different persons responding differently to the same situation. Imagine for a moment that you've agreed to participate in an experiment studying the psychology of sports performance. In this study, you learn that there's a golf putting task. You're going to have to do a little bit of mini golf. Okay? How do you think you would do at a task like that? So there's a situation you're going to have to do like a little bit of mini golfing to demonstrate your skills. Well, different people that approach this situation can be attuned to different aspects of the situation or interpret the same situation in different ways. Why might this be? Let's think about it for a moment. In the study that a social psychologist did, 2 groups of students were asked to perform the same putting task, the same mini golf task. The first group of students were randomly assigned to hear the term natural athletic ability. You were being asked to do a test of natural athletic ability. And a second group of students was told that the sports strategy, basically you have to knock that little golf ball around a few little banks to get into the hole. Okay? So natural athletic ability or strategic sports intelligence. What we see here in these graphs are the way that two different types of individuals, so characteristics of the individuals, respond to the same situation in different ways. So in the first set of graphs here, we see people who are told this is a test of natural athletic ability. Now keep in mind for this graph, for golfing behavior, that the higher number of strokes is actually worse performance. So the Caucasian Americans and the African Americans in this situation, the white and black participants, note that when the task was described as a test of natural athletic ability, the white participants actually underperformed. They did worse than the African American participants. Now when you take that same task, and whites and blacks take that same task, but it's described as a test of strategic sports intelligence, the results actually flip around. African Americans do more poorly, and Caucasian Americans do better. So what's the deal here? The deal is that African Americans and Caucasian Americans carry in their minds representations, mental representations, that affect their interpretation of this task. One of the things that Caucasian Americans are concerned about is that they lack natural athletic ability, and when confronted with a task that might assess that, they become nervous and preoccupied and are less likely to perform well. In contrast, African Americans are informed by a stereotype and concerned about a stereotype that African Americans are somehow less intelligent. They don't necessarily believe that, but they're aware of that stereotype out there, and that can make them nervous and affect their performance. And that's indeed the interpretation of these researchers, that one stereotype interferes with white participants' behavior, and the other type of interpretation or concern interferes with African American behavior. Another form of interaction we need to think about is a person-situation fit. This is the extent to which a person and a situation are compatible. When people are looking for a good employee, this is the kind of thing they're looking for. When students are looking for a career or an educational path, this is also part of what they're looking for. Am I the type of person that would enjoy a career as an engineer? Am I the type of person who would enjoy working like a psychologist? Okay? So when employees' personal characteristics, interests, goals, abilities, values, traits fit with the demands and opportunities of their occupations, employees tend to be happier and are more likely to stay in their jobs and remain committed to those jobs. We also choose situations that provide opportunities that fit our personal characteristics. So if you're an introvert, you might gravitate towards a job that allows you to have a quiet environment. Similarly, you might tend to occupy environments that are less socially stimulating. Okay? We also talk about different situations priming different parts of the person. So remember, priming is just kind of like reminding you or bringing into consciousness parts of your personality. So inside each of us, there are many different motives, memories, and feelings and aspects of ourselves. And each of these is likely to be triggered by some situations more than others. So for example, after watching a slapstick comedy, the researchers found that slapstick comedy primed memories of innocent accidents, and an ambiguous collision between a stranger after this kind of viewing tends to draw this type of reaction. Oops, I'm sorry, how clumsy of me. However, when a person is watching a action thriller and there's more aggression in that situation, a bump from a person might cause a more aggressive response. And this is basically saying that this type of environment stimulates certain kinds of aspects of the person and leads to different interpretations and different reactions in social settings. Finally, let's finish up by saying that situations over time tend to change the person, and here we're sort of emphasizing culture. Socialization is the process through which culture teaches its members about its beliefs, customs, habits, and language through a learning process, rewarding certain beliefs or encouraging certain beliefs and customs and habits, and discouraging others. And this process tends to lead to differences between individualists and collectivists that we mentioned earlier. And we can examine social behavior in terms of those differences. So I will post another questionnaire that you can answer, and I'll give you some instructions about how to score that questionnaire, and you can kind of see for yourself whether you tend to be more individualist or more collectivist. And that's the end of this lecture. Thank you.